Now we've talked about adding a domain controller to an existing domain. Let's go ahead and actually do that. When you first bring up Server 2012, it brings up this dashboard. In this dashboard, we need to go ahead and click the Add Roles and Features option, and then click Next. We can click Next one more time, and then we want to verify that the computer that we are trying to add to the domain is actually the correct computer and is highlighted, which it is. And so let's go ahead and click Next again. In this box, we need to select the role or feature we wish to add. In this case, since we're trying to create a domain controller, we need to add the Active Directory domain services. So click on that, and this brings up this dialog box here that verifies the features that will be added when you do this. Go ahead and click Add here, and then click Next. Click Next one more time because we don't want to add any extra features to it. And then finally, click one last time. Now, in this box, we have the option to restart the server automatically, or we can leave it unchecked and restart it manually. For this installation, I'll go ahead and leave it unchecked. Now, click the Install button. When you click the Install button, the installation process will begin. This will take a little bit of time, so we need to wait for it to get done with that. Now that the Active Directory role has been added, you come up to this dialog box. You'll notice in this dialog box we have a link called Promote this server to a domain controller. We want to go ahead and click that because until we promote this server, it will not be able to be a domain controller. When we click that link, it brings us to the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard. The only way to get to this wizard is through adding the Active Directory Directory Services role. Once we bring up the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard, you'll notice we have three options here. One, we can add a domain controller to an existing domain. That is what we're going to do this time. Alternatively, we can add a new domain to an existing forest. In this case, we have a forest of domains or a group of domains, and we're going to add a new one to it. And finally, we have the option of adding a new forest. When you're setting up the first domain on a large network, then this would actually be the option you would pick for your very first domain. Because when you create your very first domain, you also need to create the forest that that domain goes in. Well, now we've got the add a domain controller to an existing domain. We then come down here and we can either directly type in the value of the domain, which in this case is random domain, or we can click select, which will bring up a dialog box asking for our user credentials. The user credentials we need to use are the domain controller's administrative credentials. To indicate the domain controller's administrative credentials, we need to start out with the name of the domain. In this case, random domain, and then slash, and then the user's credentials. Once you put in the administrator's domain credentials, we then go ahead and use the password that we use for that domain controller. And then we can click OK. Clicking OK will bring up a dialog box where the server will begin looking for any domains that exist within the current forest. In this case, it found only one domain, and that is the random domain. So you go ahead and select the domain you want to use, and then click OK. And this then fills in the domain dialog box here, and it also filled in the credentials for the domain administrator, and so we can go ahead and click Next. Now the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard is going to ask for the password that we want to use to restore for the restore mode in case it's necessary. In this case, you can just use the password of the current computer. Also in this box, I want you to notice a couple of options that we will talk about later in the course. One, we have the domain name system server. In this case, we don't necessarily have to set this up because we're adding this to an already existing domain controller that has DNS installed. We'll go ahead and leave it here, though, for our purposes. Also, we have the option to either make this a global catalog, which it is by default, or to remove that option. We want to go ahead and In this case, go ahead and leave it as a global catalog server. And finally, we have the option of a read-only domain controller. Now, this would be done if you have a multiple servers in one site. You might want to do a read-only domain controller so that the server isn't used for anything else. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and leave it alone because that's the default setting. And then we'll go ahead and click Next. Now, this DNS error here, you can go ahead and ignore it because this is basically asking for internet access, something that we don't have in this virtual environment. And so it's not able to find the primary DNS servers. But we can go ahead and ignore that and just click Next. And then click Next one more time. And then Next again. And then Next again. And now we'll let it go ahead and do its prerequisite checks and wait. Now it's gone ahead and done all its prerequisite checks, which it has successfully passed. We can finally go ahead and click the Install button. Okay. At this point, it's going to ask to restart the computer. One thing I'd like to point out is that under this result heading right here, you can't see it, but it actually tells us that we were successful in installing our domain controller. Now the domain controller has restarted itself. Now that the server has finished restarting, we can go ahead and log on to the local server, but this time we're going to have to use the domain admin password and credentials. Now that the server has rebooted itself and loaded the server manager, there are a couple things we can look at to demonstrate that this server really did become a domain controller. The first off is over here on the sidebar, you have an Active Directory Services tile and a DNS tile. Neither one of these tiles were there previously, and so they indicate that this server is indeed a domain controller. Finally, we can come up here and look at the local server. And under the local server, you'll notice over here under domain, it now says that it is a member of the randomdomain.edu, something that it was not a member of previously.